can't tell you what that's.
Sweet bonny boat, like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to sky. Though the waves leap, soft shall ye sleep, ocean's a royal bed. Rocked in the deep, Flora will keep watch o'er your weary head. Sweet bonny boat, like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors fly. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to sky. Burnt are our homes, exile and death, scattered the loyal man. Yet ere the sword cool in the sheath, Charlie will come again. Sweet bonny boat, like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to sky. Then is the lad fought on that day, well the claymore could wield. When the night came, silently lay, dead in Culloden's field. Sweet bonny boat, like a bird on the wing, onward the sailors cry. Carry the lad that's born to be king, over the sea to sky.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for being here and for supporting each other through this really emotional time. My name is Rita Cohan. I'm a civil celebrant, and I'm honoured, though deeply saddened, to lead this memorial service today along with my colleagues from Tobin Brothers. After this ceremony, you're warmly invited back to Gavin's home to share some time together and enjoy some refreshments, 17 Edward Street in Kew. We've gathered here in sorrow to honour the memory of a truly remarkable man, Donald Beale Didsbury, affectionately known to all just as Don. Don left us suddenly but peacefully on Sunday the 8th of December at around 7 a.m. at Box Hill Hospital, where he'd been admitted just the day before. Don had reached the grand age of 93 years and 6 months. The writer Marcel Proust said, "We say that the hour of death cannot be forecast, but when we say this, we imagine that hour as placed in an obscure and distant future. It never occurs to us that it has any connection with the day which has already begun, or that death could arrive that same afternoon. This afternoon, which is so certain, which has every hour filled in advance." And so it was for Don. On the Saturday, he went into hospital. The doctors explained that Don would need a blood transfusion. "How long is all that going to take?" he grumbled to Gavin. "Well, it could take a little while, Dad," Gavin gently explained. Don wasn't convinced. "Well, I better be back in time for the Sunday roast at Blue Cross." And very early on the Sunday morning, Gavin was with his dad. Don was sleeping soundly and snoring, his major concern possibly missing out on his lunch. Very gently, Don left us. He slipped his moorings, he sailed away. With no fear, no worry about the future, no pain. It's as serene a way to die as one can possibly hope for. Up until his stroke in July, Don was still living in the family home in Elvey Road, surrounded by all that was important, comforting and familiar to him. And all the family had been really pleased to see he'd settled in pretty well at Blue Cross Aged Care in Box Hill. And understandably, after much resistance, he agreed to go there because it was a really big thing for him to leave his home. Don's mind was as sharp as ever, positive and engaged to his last day. The death of a family member is an exquisitely painful event. To the world, Don was but one man, but to his family, Don was an irreplaceable part of their world. And our hearts reach out today to Don's nearest and dearest, Don's devoted son, Gavin, Don's son-in-law, Alan Thompson, Don's 3 grandsons, Rowan, Christopher and Jeremy. Don was a much-loved uncle to Rhonda, Melinda, Alison, Graham and Barbara. And Don was so delighted when he became a grandfather and was thrilled with every new addition to his family tree. Being there for his family in any way he could through all those years had brought him immense satisfaction. His family were always his top priority. Don's love for his family was not the soft and mushy kind. He was reserved a bit in that department. His love was strong and constant. It brought reassurance and comfort. You just knew that you were loved. It is a significant day indeed when we gather to honour a life and mourn a death. You're all here because you cared deeply about Don. You treasure the role he played in your life. This is a vulnerable time, a time when all of us in one way or another are confronted with feelings of loss and uncertainty. We're all at different stages in our life. Our paths are varied. We look at life in different ways. But what connects us all is our shared humanity. Don's death unites us in a way that no other human experience possibly can. And at times like this, family, friends, and memories are what we really cling to. Don's death reminds us just how fragile life really is. It can go just like that. The price we pay for loving someone is grief. And all we can do is try to create a new normal and integrate that loss into ourselves and into our daily lives. When I sat down with Gavin last week, he shared many stories and spoke bravely and openly about the kind of person Don was, and for that I thank him most sincerely. Gavin painted a picture of a modest man, family-orientated, unfailingly polite, down to earth, a man who prized order and routine, had unshakable integrity, an inexhaustible enthusiasm for life, with a sparkle in his eye and a huge smile. And as a father, as a husband, a father-in-law and a grandfather, Don had been loyal, dependable, considerate and always, always there for them. Don was a man who understood that being happy and rich in life had absolutely nothing to do with your possessions. He realised that being happy and rich in life had everything to do with the people you had in your life and the quality of the relationships you built and nurtured with your partner, your family and your friends. You've all talked and laughed and hugged and cried and sat around his table, enjoyed endless cups of tea and cake, and celebrated numerous family events with Don. And he never sought to be the centre of attention, preferring to keep to himself a bit. So he's probably cringing right now with all the attention that we're giving him. But a loving celebration of Don's life is most important, because he touched numerous lives in big ways and small ways. And everything in this service today has been prepared with great care for a man who endeared himself to everyone who was lucky enough to get to know him and was respected, admired and held in high esteem by everyone. So despite the sadness we feel, let's recall Don's life with thankfulness as we stand united now to pay our last respects, to honour what Don stood for, and to honour how he lived those 93 years, as we recall and celebrate Don's aspirations, his achievements, and his loves. So on the 20th of January 1934 in Edinburgh, Scotland, proud parents Samuel and Harriet Didsbury welcomed their second child, a son, Donald Beale. Don had a big brother, Ian, who was 2 years older than him, and Ian sadly died in 1979. Don's father worked as the caretaker for the enormous and historic Edinburgh Castle in Edinburgh. It was a responsible and very important position. And in the 1930s, there was still a sentry guard at those castle gates who would demand of all wishing to enter, "Who goes there?" On one occasion, young Don fronted up to the castle gate on an errand for his dad and loudly answered, "It's Donald Didsbury, the caretaker's son. I'm bringing Dad's false teeth. He's forgotten them at home." Don grew up during the harsh economic times of the 1930s depression, and it was a given then to never throw anything away. You repaired it or you recycled it. And these qualities of thriftiness, resourcefulness and practicality stayed with Don his whole life. With the soul of a true Scotsman, he was always very careful with his money and he had a keen eye for a bargain. Don was raised in a generation centred around solid, traditional values. Family life, community spirit and helping each other out were at the core of everyday life. He grew up in an era when saying "I love you" all the time just did not happen. You showed your love by your actions. You showed your love by being respectful. You showed your love by sticking together through hard times and being someone your family could rely on. In 1938, when Don was only 12 years old, tragedy struck his family. Don's dear mother, Harriet, died of cancer. She was very young. In those days, treatment for cancer was almost non-existent. Don's father, Samuel, was so distraught when he lost his wife so young that he couldn't cope with the pressure of having 2 young boys to raise on his own. Soon after his mother's death, Don, still just a boy, was sent to Naval College. Don's father saw it as the best possible option. His son would have a stable environment, companionship, and at the same time, get a good education. After 4 years of secondary school at the Naval College, equivalent to our Year 10, Don finished his schooling and embarked on his career in the Navy. Those formative years in the British Royal Navy instilled in Don core values: commitment, courage, discipline, honour and integrity, and Don would always live by those values. At the tender age of 16, Don was assigned to his first destroyer, which was part of the convoys protecting the Nordic Arctic seas. It was 1942, and the Second World War had already been raging throughout Europe for 3 years. At that time, there was no radar on the British warships, and there were enemy submarines in those Arctic waters. So the youngest soldiers, the sailors, were strapped onto the mast of the ship and ordered to look out for the telltale submarine periscope poking out of the water, the worrying sign that the enemy was at hand. Well, surely it was like looking for a needle in a haystack. And when Don told a very young Gavin this story, young Gavin was horrified. "Oh, that's just terrible, Dad." "No," said Don. "Actually, it was great." I'm not doing a Scottish accent. "Because we had 20 minutes on and 20 minutes off. 20 minutes tied to the mast, and then we were allowed to spend 20 minutes in the galley kitchen enjoying a cup of hot cocoa to warm up before they strapped us out on the mast again." From a young age, our Don had an uncanny ability to seek out a silver lining in most situations. The following year, 1943, on Boxing Day, at Cape York in northern Norway, Don's ship, the Jamaica, was involved in a famous and hard-fought battle, resulting in the sinking of the German Navy's premier and most feared battleship, the Scharnhorst. This momentous achievement was absolutely seared into Don's memory. Gavin remembers that without fail, on every Boxing Day, Don would announce gleefully, "Today is the day we sank the Scharnhorst." And any mention of the word check at home, I hope I get this right, Gavin, Don would break out into the Navy rope-based check, 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 ammunition to the forward breech, stand by the vent and rin, belay, belay, prepare to load again. And Gavin does it much better than I do. At the peak of World War II, 3 midget submarines managed to enter undetected into Sydney Harbour. One fired 2 torpedoes, which hit a Sydney ferry and killed 19 Australians and 2 British naval officers. Now, at that time, Don had been reassigned to a submarine, which was based in Singapore. Fearful of further Japanese attacks, the Australian government asked the British Navy if Don's submarine could be used to help protect Sydney Harbour. But there was another story happening. Fate has remarkable ways of bringing people together who are meant to be together. For some reason, Don was put onto a passenger ship in Singapore and told to meet up again with his submarine in Sydney. And that passenger ship was going to pick up passengers from Perth, Adelaide and Melbourne before docking once again into Sydney Harbour. It just so happened that as that ship sailed into Princess Pier in Port Melbourne, excitedly waiting to board was a beautiful, clever and vivacious young woman called Gleda Coates, who, along with her girlfriend, was bound for Sydney for a much looked forward to holiday. Somehow, Don and Gleda met each other on board. And during the few days it took for that ship to head north to Sydney, they got to know each other pretty well. And by the time they disembarked, they both knew they had met the one. On the 30th of May 1951, at Gardner Church of Christ in Melbourne, the tall, very handsome Don and Gleda, with her movie star looks, so elegant in a traditional white wedding dress, became husband and wife. It was the start of an enduring and precious love, and they vowed to always be there for one another in sickness and in health, and they would never falter on that promise for a single moment over the next 48 years. The name Glida originates from Iceland and actually means to make happy. And Glida lived up to her name with flying colours. She made her Don very, very happy. And Don would be devastated when his beautiful Glida would die of cancer in 2001. So the newlyweds settled down to married life, initially living with Glida's parents. And they were thrilled to bits with the arrival in 1953 of their first child, Gavin. When Gavin was 3, Don was ordered to go back to Scotland to partake in one more mission before being demobilised from the British Navy and officially then being released from active service. So off he goes with Glida and his little son to a tiny Scottish town called Aberdour, which would be their home for the next 3 years. The British government at that time was determined to ensure the total destruction of the captured German Navy's submarine fleet, and scuttling them then was deemed to be the cheapest option to get rid of them. So all the doomed submarines were brought into a place called Scapa Flow, where they have a very special harbour. People are nodding here. In the Orkney Islands, that was way, way, way up there. Now, that had been the naval base for the Arctic convoy battleships which Don had been on when he, from 16 to 19 years of age, he'd been on them. And Don was to be part of a very special team given the job of sinking all those captured German submarines. Well, true to form, our silver lining Don had told Gavin the story of the hidden advantages of this otherwise gruelling task. Food rationing was still heavily enforced in the UK at that time, and the Germans, Don said, had been masterful at hiding food supplies in those submarines. So before they sent that U-boat to its watery grave, Don and his fellow sailors scoured every single nook and cranny of every submarine, salvaging whatever non-perishables they could find. Simple things like chocolate and biscuits and baked beans. And it seems really strange to us now that simple treats like that were so highly coveted. Once released from the Navy, Don, as a 10-pound pom, emigrated back to Australia with his family. Glida and Don set up their forever home in Alvey Road in 1957 and were delighted when a year later their beautiful little daughter, Merrin, arrived. Don had a very traditional side to him, reflective of the times. Inside the house was Glida's domain, including being the main disciplinarian and nurturer for the children. And Don took his role as husband, father and provider very seriously. He was determined to give his own family the best he possibly could and was happy to let Glida keep them all well fed and organised and out of trouble. And every Sunday, the whole family attended church together for an 11 a.m. service, followed by a wonderful roast lunch with the all-important apple pie and ice cream, said Gavin, at Grandma Jessie's, Glida's mum, and then to the 7 p.m. church service to finish off the day. Sunday was actually a very special time for them. It was the only time in the whole week that they could spend the whole day together. Now, unusually for a Scotsman, Don didn't swear. Although Glida took on the lion's share of the child rearing, Gavin recalled that if you ever heard Don say, "Stone the crows," you were in a bit of trouble. But if he said, "Stone the bloody crows," you better hightail out of there pretty quick smart. Don was very keen to start his own business. He took some classes at RMIT, learning all he could about how to repair black and white television sets. Waverley TV Service was born, and for the next 13 years, he ran the business from Alvey home, with Glida handling the office side of it. The business did well. However, when colour TV arrived, black and white TVs were instantly obsolete, and the business, unfortunately, closed down. Interesting years followed, though, for Don. He secured a job in the court system working as a judge's associate. for a very upright, by-the-book, stern English female judge. Now, he was used to that authoritarian approach from his naval days, and her demeanour actually suited him perfectly, and he thoroughly enjoyed working there up until his retirement. He was encouraged by Gleda to think about doing something else with his time. So Don worked as a volunteer, telephone counsellor for Lifeline. Now, there's a certificate there awarding him and honouring him for 37 years of service, but he actually only stopped working there at age 91. So this is only 2 years ago. And he by then had clocked up 40 years of service. Can you imagine the thousands of people he's actually helped over those 40 years? Don's retirement luckily coincided with the arrival of Merrin and Alan's 3 boys. Don and Gleda loved being grandparents, and those 3 boys kept them young at heart and on their toes, and whenever they got together, laughter and cuddles were always on the agenda. Don and Gleda loved spending quality time with their boys, and they're sitting up here, 3 wonderful young men, and they felt especially blessed to see their children and their grandchildren grow into such good people. And they were intensely proud of all their achievements. It's my pleasure now to invite Chris, Jeremy and Rowan with their very loving tribute to their grandpa. You're reading from your piece, yeah?
Well, I've spent the last few days, as we all have, thinking about Don, or as he was known to us, as Grandpa. It's near impossible to put into words how important he was in our lives or try to distill his essence down to just a few memories, but there are a few that I'd like to share because of how they embody who Don was to me and my brothers as our beloved grandfather. Now, as all of his grandsons can attest, we got to know Don best over a cup of tea. I remember going to visit him at Mount Waverley, first as a little kid with Mum, then as a family during school, and then, most recently, individually as an adult. We'd either sit under his handmade stained glass light shade at his dining table, or on one of his navy blue sofas looking out of the window at the view of the gigantic orange tree in the front yard of his family home. We'd talk about cricket, football, his studies at U3A or his volunteer work at Lifeline. Sometimes when there wasn't much to talk about, we'd simply stare out the window and admire the view. But more often than not, he'd talk about everyday life, which was often stooped in routine, but somehow he had a special ability to find the funny or quirky side to the idiosyncrasies of everyday life. This was a true gift, and I'd often sit there with a huge grin, waiting to hear about his particular take on an interaction he had with someone at the bank, the library or the supermarket, or an observation he had from a TV show or his take on current affairs. Invariably, shouldn't have put so long words in this speech, he would lead him to tilting his head back and laughing in his typical fashion. Before long, you were laughing right along with him. Now, in terms of his character, he was rather stoic, outside of his very wry sense of humour and occasionally fiery temper. He was reserved without being shy, and I'll always appreciate his ability to find joy in the mundane. The thing that I admired most about Don was his quiet resolve to overcome life's challenges, such as the tragic and early passing of his wife, his daughter, and then his daughter-in-law. I watched his steely determination to overcome his own health problems. First his knee pain, and then his recovery from subsequent double knee surgeries, a near-fatal stroke, and the constant pain of shingles to top it all off. He'd rarely complain, and he'd always find a way to look on the bright side of his situation and keep moving forward. It was his enduring positive attitude and determination which saw him complete as many Anzac marches as he did and travel into towns well into his 80s and then 90s to become the longest serving members of Lifeline. He approached life's adversities with a stoic and reflective demeanour, epitomised by a phrase that I heard from him on occasion. "Oh well," he'd say, "these are the things that come to try us." His attitude has been an inspiration for me growing up, watching him handle some of life's most difficult and unpredictable moments with determination and optimism. He'll always be a permanent fixture in my mind as someone who just never gave up. My fondest memories of Don centre on his understated sense of humour and some specific mannerisms and phrases which I'm sure everyone here can remember. His foray into technology was one such example of his wry sense of humour. Now, the original purpose of his computer, amongst other things, was so that he could access his emails at home. However, in his typical way, he did confess that the computer got its best use when he was trying to solve a particularly difficult crossword. I'd often help him with his computer when visiting, and at one point when visiting, I discovered the computer was incredibly slow, taking almost 5 minutes to load the home screen. And I asked him aghast as the young technophile, "Do you wait this long every time you turn the computer on?" To which he replied, "Oh, I usually just turn it on and then go and make a cup of tea." And then by the time that I get back, it's usually ready. Just do it. Grandpa Don had some sayings and mannerisms which have been embedded into the family vernacular, and you've heard some of those already. To maintain his independence and routine, he'd often refuse our offers to help, but in his own unique way. After offering to help him with something, you'd often be met with a pause and an, "Oh, well." And this meant that it probably should be something that could be done, or it could be done, but wasn't something that he really wanted to change right now. If he thought that something was a better idea, you'd discover less resistance because he would pause and say, "Well?" And then you knew that there was close to a 40% chance that you could convince him to move forward with something. And if he was really keen on what you're offering, he'd say something like, "Oh, well, all right." And another one was when we were kids and we were caught fighting with each other, you'd often hear him in a stern voice say, "Steady the buffs." A lot of our visits to him were when we went to see plays at Peridot Theatre. On the way to the theatre, we'd all pile into our old blue station wagon as kids. Grandpa Don would often be in the back with us. The first part of the journey was the hardest in a station wagon because it involved reversing down his steep, narrow driveway at night. And by the time the wheels hit the curb, the driver would need to check the road for cars, which could be rather difficult. And you would often hear Don calling out with one of his sayings, which was presumably learned in the Submariners, which was, "All clear, the vent in rear." And this meant that whoever's driving could proceed to reverse out of the driveway without causing a traffic accident. And that was so long as they were able to dodge the brick fence on either side. This saying would become a standing operating procedure in our family whenever reversing down his driveway, regardless of whether Don was in the car or not. Most recently, the three of us got our first glimpse at Don's fiery side, which Gavin had rumoured of in various tales from the past. For me, it was just a few months ago when I went over to help Gavin moved Don's furniture at Mount Waverley so that we could replace the carpet in his home. I watched as Gavin would carefully reassure Don of the steps being taken, what would be happening next, when the carpet layers would arrive, and when we would be moving his furniture back. After Gavin and I had moved the furniture, we were about to leave, and Don made it very clear, "Now hang on, I'd better have a jolly bed to sleep on." Having only ever seen Don as a very softly spoken stoic, I left with eyebrows raised and a small grin, having finally witnessed the fabled temper that I'd heard so much about. I would often get some amusement at family gatherings listening to Gavin explain all of the things that he was doing at Alvey Road, what items hadn't been moved at his place since he was a kid, and how much dust had collected in certain places. I'd then also be amused to listen to Don's point of view. He'd recant how much Gavin was changing things, why things could just stay in the same place, and why it wasn't really necessary to move these things in the first place. In the same breath, he would also admit, "Well, it's good, I suppose, and he does a good job." And that told me that beneath his reticence to change, he appreciated it and could see how Gavin was helping him. After Don's stroke, he had some small difficulty with names, places and events, but the rest of his brain was still firing on all 4 cylinders. One day, when visiting him at the Blue Cross aged care home, Don sought out a cup of tea for both him and I from an unprepared staff member, and this brought some amusement to Don. Upon her return with the 2 cups of tea, Don mentioned that, well, he wouldn't mind some milk as well with the tea. And the lady darted off to the kitchen in search of milk. Grandpa gave me a sideways glance and his typical eye roll. She returned with an additional cupful of milk and disappeared. And as she left, Don turns to me incredulously and remarks, "And what are we meant to stir it with? A bloody screwdriver or something?" And we laughed. This confirmed to me that besides him being a little bit slow with speech, nothing else about him had really changed. Now, through all of these memories, Grandpa Don was always so full of life that I don't think that his passing really hit me and really brought it home until just this week. Don was very thoughtful, and every year, like clockwork, a week before Christmas, he would send a handwritten Christmas card to each of his 3 grandsons. You could always tell it was from him at first glance because the envelope would be addressed in his unmistakable handwriting with big capital letters saying, "To Mr. Jeremy or Rowan or Christopher Thompson." As I was bringing in some mail from the postbox last week, it sadly struck me that this year would be the first year since as long as I can remember that there would be no Christmas card to expect from Alvey Road, Mount Waverley. These memories of Don remind me of what a wonderful grandfather he was and how much he'll be missed. I'll always remember him as a kind, loving person who displayed perfectly what it meant to deal with life's challenges and keep a wonderful sense of humour along the way. I'm truly grateful for all of the time that I got to spend with him, even if it was just sitting next to him with a cup of tea, staring out the front window.
That's not going up on it.
I'm speaking next year. Yeah. Hold on. This is Jeremy. This is you, Jeremy.
That's what all
You got your own?
Perfect.
You read your own. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, God. This is you?
Yeah. Well, I'd just like to share a few thoughts and reflect on some of the time spent with Grandpa, just to highlight the impact he's had on me and my brothers, as well as the example he's set through his approach to life. Grandpa probably spent more time with us than we can remember, teaching us the basics of sport movement, such as throwing a ball, or throwing and catching and kicking a ball. Out on the front lawn of our childhood home at Redfern Court, Grandpa would teach us how to properly kick a soccer ball with the side of our foot. He would teach us how to catch a ball while having us stand tall and hold our arms out straight before shuffling back and throwing the ball into our outstretched arms. He would remark in delight at our successful catches in his softly spoken Scottish accent. His support for our sporting endeavours continued into our school days, where he'd frequently come and watch us at athletic days, football finals and other sporting events. Until the age of 90, he was intent on marching in the Anzac Day Parade, which he did every year. Only after a double knee reconstruction did he see it necessary to complete the march in one of the provided cars. On one of the last Anzac marches, we all ended up walking back from the shrine in St Kilda Road, all the way through Flinders Street Station to find the car. Don completed this feat without complaint after a double knee reconstruction. Don held himself with a certain gravitas during these marches. His sober expression would be interrupted with a wink or a smile and a shy wave when he saw his family members periodically between Flinders Street and the shrine. Grandpa held himself upright at all times. However, his perfect posture predated his involvement with the Navy. He told us that this was drilled into him at a young age by his father, who would give him a sharp flick on the back if he was ever caught slouching. His great posture didn't prevent a few recent incidents. There were a few falls. During his assessments to understand if he could keep living independently, he did conveniently forget to mention to the assessor that earlier that morning he'd fallen over not once, not twice, but 3 times in the space of a couple of hours. It was often the things that weren't said that carried the most weight with Don. Grandpa had many assessments recently, but none as memorable as an assessment he had when we were young kids. Grandpa was fixing an electrical fixture in Mount Waverley when he was delivered a violent shock, resulting in a head injury which baffled his doctors. After his assessment, the doctors remarked, "Excuse me for saying, Mr. Didsbury, but you've got the thickest skull we've ever seen." Visits to Grandpa evolved only slightly over the years. They always involved a structure which was mutually respected. Perhaps the reason we all respected this structure was because at a young age, following a meal at Grandpa's, one of us would religiously be sent to the freezer in the study to find the ice cream, which would be combined with a tin of peaches for dessert, and this happened without exception. Words were often a waste when talking to Grandpa, and what use of words when you could see his tongue curled in concentration when he's trying to focus, his head tilt with the eye roll when he's punctuating an anecdote, or his jaw muscles tighten at any perceived threat to his independence. Conversation with Don would often start slowly, until you found yourself being quietly drawn into his world of nuance and tongue-in-cheek humour, his fascination at discussing something new he'd learnt, or his wry observation of characters he's interacted with day to day. After spending time with Grandpa, I would often leave smiling to myself with a feeling of delight. As I reflect now on the time spent with Grandpa during his life, I can't help but smile and feel that same feeling of delight. Thank you.
Sorry, I'm going to see if I can get technology to work for me. Fantastic. I don't know what all this paper stuff is, but I'm sure it's worked for some people. So the request to say a few words, when it came with a fairly specific codicil. I think you can guess who from to keep it lighthearted, which I think is good, and which I think we've done a good job of so far. And I hadn't remembered the false teeth story until you told it just before, so that was a great one. I like it. And I think it's the right approach to this scenario, because when I was sort of thinking about memories of Don, of Grandpa, the image of his face that comes to me the strongest is of when he's just coming to the end of an amusing joke or an anecdote, and he's got that characteristic set of features which these guys have already described, that little half smile and the gleam in his eye, just as he gets to the right punchline, and that to me is how I'm going to remember him. And I think that's brilliant, because obviously as people get older, the body starts to stop working as well as it did, and bits and pieces fall away to two knees in his case. But the thing that was sort of there the whole time was that sense of humour, and that never went away. So from when we were little kids, there are a few stories that I remember. And I remember them not because I was there, but because obviously you hear them told so often, that you just know that they happened. And it was mostly Mum in this case. So stuff like him teaching us to catch, or how bad the rabbits were for the garden up at Shoreham, or when he was teaching us all the different makes and models of car as we were driving up to the beach house, or what all the road signs meant. But I think there's one that kind of brings home to me, the way he was able to see the humour in every situation, and that was when I was a tiny little toddler, and I'm told I was innocently playing with buttons or something, and then decided out of the blue to pick up an umbrella and go and show it to Don, and ended up poking him straight in the eye with this the end of this long golf umbrella. And of course, panic ensues, and injury and first aid and all this kind of stuff, and it can't have been a very pleasant sensation to be stabbed by your nearest and dearest. But the fact that every time that story got told, around the dinner table in the future, he was always the one who was laughing loudest at it. And I think if you can laugh at the story of your own assault, it really does show that you've got quite a sense of humour. So appreciated that. So as we got older, it got to the point where he could teach us more useful things, like how to make the perfect cup of tea, and of course, as has been mentioned, how to look both ways when backing down the driveway at Alvey Road, and the whole all clear the vent in rear. And that was one that I couldn't resist sort of throwing back at him a little bit a couple of years ago when I went to visit him, and he was recounting the fact that he'd just been up to the supermarket or something and been backing out in the car and managed to smack into the car behind him, and obviously not a big deal, just a bit of a paint job issue, and I'm obviously just thankful that everybody's okay and there's no injuries. But then, part of me is sort of thinking, should you really be telling me this at, 88 or whatever, in fear of your license? But it just got me thinking, how, he used to tell us to make sure that everything was clear and all clear the vent in rear, and I mentioned this to him, I must admit, and he had a good chuckle and freely admitted, I was absolutely right, and he should have checked, and I thought, a day after backing into something in the car park and leaving your information and insurance and whatever, I'd be really annoyed or frustrated or angry or whatever. And here he was just laughing about it. And I thought, that's fantastic. That's, shows the caliber of the man. Right, yes, okay, and I've reminded myself of this, that there's a lot more memories that I could share, but, the point is not to tell all the stories. The point is to remember the man and what a great guy he was. I can't think of a better way to really illustrate that than to recall the last time that I saw him and saw that classic half smile and the gleam in the eye, which was just a couple of weeks ago when we were having morning tea at Blue Cross, where he spent the last couple of months. As we were sitting down to our coffee, I said to start a conversation, so, Grandpa, tell me, what's been going on? What's happened since I last saw you? And, he leaned in and he said, well, Rowan, this is going to come as a great surprise to you, I'm sure, but there's not actually a lot that changes here from day to day. It just kind of brought home to me the fact that even though the last couple of months, he'd had... it would be fair to say some issues with his relocation. So quickly after basically having his whole world turned upside down, he was sort of self-aware enough to see the funny side and to share it with me. That I think is a sort of fantastic way to end. So much so that I got to be a little bit careful here because I know there's such a thing as too soon, but. As I was sort of picturing, standing up here, it came to me that if he could be here to kind of tell his own story, I think even he'd be able to see the humour inherent in those last couple of months, and he'd be standing here saying something along the lines of, the family, you see, they all got together and decided that, I probably wasn't in a state to live at home, and so we'd better move me to this facility, and we'll have, doctors and nurses around, and, it'll make sure that if anything ever goes wrong, no harm can come to me, and, I'll be patched up in no time. And, well, then, of course, I'm there for hardly any time at all, and then I'm gone, so I don't think that worked out quite the way that you all thought it would. And I just think that, he would he would have been able to appreciate the funny side in what's obviously a really sad situation. So for me, remembering Grandpa will always come with a reminder to, look on the bright side and try to find that silver lining. And I can't think of a nicer way to remember him.
I have to lower this microphone again. Fantastic pieces, really, really wonderful. And it's very hard to get up here and do that, so I really take my hat off to you. That was just wonderful. Well, Don loved life, he loved the people who were part of his journey, and we've heard so many stories which attest to that. And he's left a fantastic legacy. And his example, his personality, his stories will keep living on through all of you in all different ways. And he would not have hesitated for one single moment to acknowledge that his proudest and greatest life achievements were his loving marriage and his marvellous family. And the old Scottish saying could well have been Don's mantra. It goes like this: be happy while you're living, because you're a long time dead. And in many ways, Don's memorial today may encourage each of us to think even more carefully about how we each live our own life. Because at the end of our life, What really matters is our every act of kindness, courage, or sacrifice, which embraced, enriched, empowered, or encouraged others. And I'd like to share a poem rich in symbolism which rather pays homage to Don's life on the seas. In a harbour, 2 ships sailed, one setting forth on voyage and the other coming home to port. Everyone cheered the ship going out, but the ship sailing in was scarcely noticed. To this, the wise man observed, "Do not rejoice over a ship setting out to sea, for you cannot know what terrible storm it may have to endure. Rejoice for the ship that has safely reached its port, bringing its passengers home. When a child is born, all rejoice. When someone dies, all weep. This is the usual way of the world. But when a man dies in peace, we should rejoice, for he has reached his final harbour and completed a very long journey." To you all, Don's dearest family and close friends, we offer our deepest sympathy, and may you find comfort from each other in the days to come. Don, we applaud your very long life. There were challenging, painful times and heartwarming, playful times. We remember your resilience, your positivity, your commitment to family, your feistiness, your mischievous sense of humour, your determination. And when you think of Don, it will be the little things that you'll remember. So smile in your heart and give thanks for every hilarious moment, every wise word, every warm hug, for every good deed, for every special saying, for all that Don gave. And in closing today, Don's life we honour, and his departure we accept. And may you always feel the power of Don's love. May you always sense the warmth of his spirit. And as we learn to live without Don in our lives, may we find solace in our memories of all that was amazing and inquiring and inspiring and unique about him. For an ordinary bloke, he was pretty extraordinary. Thank you, Don, for the shining example of a life well lived and a life lived with so much love. We now gently and reverently say, farewell, Don. Rest in peace. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please be upstanding to honour Don? And this piece of music has been very, very specially chosen